equity, diversity, inclusion, neoliberalism, radical cultural feminism. There are a lot of words, ideas, and concepts we come across. How do we wrap our heads around one of them, let alone all? Let's find out. We're going to touch on the glossary. Before, we talked about different kinds of barriers. We all have them, internal and external obstacles that make it difficult for us to take action. We discussed how most of our time is best spent solving internal barriers, as that's where we have the most control. For external, we have to be strategic, understanding that sometimes we're in a strong position, other times not so much. With an acceptance of our changing context, self-responsibility to do our part, have identified our barriers, we are now in a position to define equity and other important terms. There are a lot of terms that are all about and are relevant to the work to bring about more fair and just institutions. We'll cover a number of these in this guidebook. There will, of course, be many others we won't be able to cover with this particular series. It can feel overwhelming reading a multi-page glossary with dozens of words, familiar and not. On top of this, it can feel like there are competing definitions to what this work is all about. Ask 3 people and get 5 different answers. Fortunately, at this point, we don't have to master every single word, as that's not really what our aim is. Today we're focusing on how to approach new words, so each of us can use the tools for whatever terms, definitions, and ideas that are most relevant for us respectively. For our example, we're going to define equity since it is the main word, the main concept we're putting at the forefront of both the guidebook and this video series. I'm going to provide 3 definitions. Our first definition comes straight from Merriam-Webster Online, one of the most well-known dictionaries out there. Justice according to natural law or right, specifically freedom from bias or favoritism. For the second definition, we turn to ICMA, who in turn posted the National Parks and Recreation Association glossary. This particular definition they took from the World Health Organization. We can see how definitions like this can spread from institution to institution. The absence of avoidable, unfair, or remediable differences among groups of people, whether those groups are defined socially, economically, demographically, or geographically, or by any other means of stratification. Equity equals fairness and justice. Finally, our third definition is my personal favorite, from one of my readings that focused on equity in government, achieving social justice equity from problems to solutions. Social equity has evolved from a philosophical issue concerned with the social construct to a structural issue concerned with real impacts on real people's lives. In today's parlance, it is an activist notion that requires government to be a lever for change. Let's discuss what we can learn from these definitions. We can see that each has overlap, that there are similarities between 2 or among all 3 of them. We also see that each is unique, has their own spin, their own interpretation. Altogether, they form a more complete picture. We draw from each to develop a deeper understanding. We know from the definitions that when speaking about equity, we mean justice and freedom. We mean discussing people of different life circumstances, whether socially, economically, demographically, and so on. We know we're dealing with systems and structures, by the rules we live by and follow. What else can each of us pick up? What further lessons on equity have you just learned? After all, I don't have all the answers, and no doubt you can find things from your perspective that I cannot. Moving further in, how can we approach other words like we just did with equity? First off, we know words are flexible, can and do have multiple similar yet distinct definitions. For a lighter example, if we ask what is best, tacos or sandwiches, what do we mean by best? Are we talking personal preference? Which sold more nationally, internationally? Are we comparing tacos and sandwiches from the same restaurant, different places? We accept a degree of flexibility with our terms. We ground this knowing that words also have limits. If, for example, we have a public meeting, but we only post it in an obscure place that most people don't know about and is hard to find, we can't really say we're being inclusive, that we want to include the public in our process. Finally, words evolve. Equality was once the main word people used in these movements. It made sense for things like voting rights. Some people were allowed to vote, others were not. The goal was for equality, for a one-to-one comparison where those excluded could vote just like those allowed. For many of our current issues we're facing, we recognize that people have different needs, different challenges, and thus it's no longer a one-to-one comparison. One neighborhood may most need a park renovated, another their streets plowed earlier, and a third could really use some grace and leniency with code enforcement. It's why equity has gained more steam, more in providing to each what they need. The biggest takeaway I can offer is to focus on understanding over memorization. I would rather each of us know 3 or 4 terms deeply than to kind of get 20 terms on a more surface level. If we're worried about using the right word in the right moment, we can better achieve that by knowing the flexibility, limits, and evolution of a few core terms over a partial picture of many. Quality first, quantity later. For our optional exercise, I encourage each of us to pick a word other than equity. What's something you've heard before but didn't quite understand? What's the popular word floating around your organization or department? What's something that a colleague has expressed to you? Find a few definitions. Start with one word for now, and more can come later. For those who want to start getting advanced, don't just build an understanding of equity-related terms. Start defining the words of our organizations, our professions, our communities. Land use, public service, leadership, all terms we know at least on the surface level, but when we dig deeper, what are the underlying implications? Is our land use geared towards future change? Is it about holding to traditions? A loose guideline with many variants passed? Or firm and adamant? What's the benchmark set for public service compared to just average work, if anything? What kind of leadership is valued and what kind of leadership not so much? Earlier we discussed best when it came to sandwiches and tacos, but what is our organization's definition for best when it comes to a job applicant? An RFP for a project, how we define and serve our community. And that's a quick run-through of how we can start learning about new terms and ideas like in a glossary. Up next, we're going to cover categories, that is how we organize people through demographics and other means when seeing who we need to serve better.